I'm David Faulkner. I am the head of property management for Property Brokers. I'm based in the most interesting town in Palmerston North, thanks to the Spanish football team, Palmerston North. I actually think if the Spanish had come over here, they probably would have stayed a bit longer. But anyway, they did wonders for tourism for Palmerston North, and but quite amusing. Anyway, maybe that's why they won the World Cup. And you probably tell I'm not from these shores. I'm originally from the UK. Came over here in 2001. I actually came over here in the mid-90s to play rugby down in Southland. And that was my first experience of New Zealand housing. And I have to say, I've never been so cold in my life. And the other thing was, this is before the days of Street View, Google Maps, internet, whatever. And I just got approached to say, look, there's a club down in Southland and they're looking for prop forwards. Do you want to go and play? And I thought, I'm a bit of an adventurist. And decided, yeah, I'll go for it. Thinking, look at the map and I see Lumsden on the map. Anyone been to Lumsden? Yeah. So Lumsden's on the map, and I'm thinking, well, it's on the map. Must be 40,000 people live there, not knowing the population of New Zealand, whatever. Anyway, got the fright of my life when I got there. Anyway, long story short, fell in love with the country. Moved here permanently in 2001. Married, wife's from Manchester. I'm from not far outside of Liverpool, so a bit of rivalry there, but that's all right. And, 3 kids, and this has been home for 20-odd years, and love the place. And I kind of stumbled into property management, which a lot of people do, and just a bit of an advocate for the industry. It's a fascinating industry to work in. So if anybody actually thinks of a career change or has got younger siblings or whoever is looking for a career, it's a great job to work in. And we've got a fantastic team of property managers here, which you'll meet in a moment when I show one of the slides which introduces them. And one of the great things about the industry, it's recession-proof. At some point, people need to rent, regardless of what's going on in the economy. And it's a diverse job. No 2 days are the same, and you see all sorts. There's a book in me. I've got some fascinating stories that I could share with you, but I won't be sharing them today. But anyway, what I want to do is just a quick slide, and it basically introduces our fantastic Wanganui property management team, and they'll be able to just give you a bit of a wave at the end and be able to introduce yourselves. I'm sure they'll be able to shout you a drink or two. So hopefully this works.
Hi, I'm Reinhardt from Property Brokers Property Management in Wanganui.
Hi, I'm Emma.
Hi, I'm Raywin. Hi, I'm Michelle from Property Brokers.
Here in Wanganui, we have a great team of property managers here at Property Brokers.
And they're fantastic at what they do.
I love working as a property manager because I get to work with a diverse group of people.
I love being able to help people into their homes. I love the smile on their faces when they're approved for a property. Wanganui is a fantastic city.
I love Wanganui because of all the great things that we have, like the Basin Reserve, Gulfai Park, the Waimarie Air.
It's friendly, it's beautiful, and there's always something to do. I love the fact that everything's so close. You've got the beach, 10 minutes later you've got the river, an hour and a bit away you've got the mountain.
It's just such a lovely place.
Property brokers are unique in offering our service guarantees.
We guarantee your rent or we will pay. We guarantee tenants or we will pay.
We promise to provide the best service, as that's what sets us apart at Property Brokers.
We make it easy for our tenants with our online portal. They can report any maintenance. Our owners can also look at their records throughout the month. We have our 0800 number after hours so that any maintenance is dealt with straight away.
We go to great lengths to keep your investment in check.
To find out more, call Wanganui's leading property management team today. We'd love to help you.
So there they are, those wonderful, beautiful people. So we got Reinhardt, who heads them, and we've got Sarah, Hayley, Raywin, Michelle and Emma at the back. So I've just given a little bit of a wave, and there you go. That wasn't too hard, was it? You don't have to do any speeches. Anyway, there you go. So preparing for the rebound. So what you got to do, you got to hear from me, then you got to hear from Chris Pedersen. We'll have a bit of a panel session Q&A later on, and the bar's open. Property brokers are always very, very generous when it comes to drinks, and so feel free to stay as long as you want. And if you need to get a taxi or an Uber, we'll make sure you get an Uber. But trust me, don't get on a Lime scooter, because I had a bit of an accident on one of them last Thursday. Now, who can name this movie? Moneyball. Right. Now, this is based on this gentleman here. This gentleman is called Billy Beane. And if you haven't seen Moneyball, it's on Netflix. It's a fantastic film. And what it does, and there's a lot that we can correlate with Moneyball into what we do and advice that we can give you, which I'll demonstrate in a moment. But the basis of this film is that you've got a gentleman who is coaching the Oakland A's, or he's the general manager, sorry, of the Oakland A's, and his job is to build a roster, build a team of players. But he's got to do it on a small budget. So, for example, I think he's got an annual budget of $44 million to build a team. And he's up against the New York Yankees, which have got something like $150 million. And anyway, he realises that I cannot compete based on just the finances or whatever. If I get top players, they have a great season. What happens is that they're going to get poached next season. So what they end up doing is he finds a data analyst, which is played by the guy next to Brad Pitt. Forget the guy's name. But his name in real life is Paul de Podesta. And he is a statistician. And what they end up doing is analysing all the data on players. So what they end up picking players, not because of the glamour or how good they look or how hard they pick the ball, it's who can get to first base. All right? And they're able to build a championship-winning roster which breaks a record of 20 consecutive wins in the baseball. And true story, and it's brilliant to watch. Now, I've got this theory that our industry, and we're starting to learn how to do this in our industry now, it's based on data. There's still very much that human element. People do business with people they like. I say that in a lot of our training sessions with our property managers. You've got to build that relationship with your clients. But sometimes we get decisions wrong because it's based on individual opinions. What we're trying to do is learn from the data that we collect. Now, we manage 7,000 properties plus all over the country. I think we're actually the third biggest landlord in the country behind the States, Kyangga, and Barfoot and Thompson. And then there's us. You've got your Harcourts, you've got your Ray Whites, but they're franchises, so they're individual offices. Where we collectively manage it from Palmerston North, all the accounts come, and we can analyse all this data. But there's also lots of data available to you guys, which are able to give you trends as to what's happening and help you with your financial decisions. And that's one thing, is collecting data. The next thing is, what do you do with it? You know, you've got to use it in a way that helps project your business. And if you're a landlord, you are in business. As an example, this here is data which is readily available off the Tenancy Services website. All you have to do is Google rent and bond data or Tenancy Services, Tenancy Tribunal data, and you can get this. And you're able to download these slides. And I've only been doing this for 3-4 years now. And the data you get from this can be quite invaluable. Now, the only problem with these screens is I have a pointer and the pointer doesn't work, so I'm going to have to turn my back and show you. So on the left-hand side, we've got the Tenancy Services data from the quarter just gone. So it does it in every quarter. This is quarter 2, April to June 2023. On the right, we've got April to June 2022. What we are starting to see is an increase in applications to the Tenancy Tribunal by landlords. I actually thought we would see an increase in applications by tenants because under our current governments, we've seen strengthening of tenants' rights. And I'll be honest, I think tenants' rights should be strengthened. I think tenants need to be protected. But you also got to look after landlords because the state cannot house everybody. Now, the information that you see from here is that on the left-hand side, landlord applications have increased significantly in the quarter from the previous year to over 5,000. Now, many of these, and you can see the trend, this is since records began. On the left-hand side, 6,000 in the very first quarter. Then you see this huge drop in quarter 2, 2020. Why? COVID. COVID. So what they did, or what the state did, you used to be able to send your 14-day notice. If someone was 21 days more in arrears, you can get termination through the tribunal. I think they extended that to 60 days. So the 14-day notice was defunct. And you saw a massive drop in rent arrears applications. Then it starts to increase, but nothing like to the levels of what we saw prior to COVID. We're just starting to see a trend. It's dropped a little bit in the last quarter, but we've started to see a trend of increased applications. Now, that could be around issues around cost of living. What we are finding, I'm sure our property management team will back this up, the Tenancy Tribunal is becoming far less reluctant in evicting people. The judiciary is meant to be separate from the executive, so government and tribunal, they're not really meant, I'm sure they talk, all right? And I sense that there's a direction to not evict people from homes. So the tribunal we try and avoid it. Not at all costs, sometimes we have to go, and sometimes you need to go to get clarifications on law. All right? What I thought we would have seen, we've seen a little bit of a spike in the last quarter. I would have thought we would have seen a greater amount of tenants exercising their rights through the tribunal. We haven't really seen that yet. But what we do see is the tenants that do, they are far more aggressive in their demands. A lot of them are going to tenant advocacy groups. And these advocacy groups are actually not doing them any favours because they're coming with outlandish claims of up to $50,000 when really they get a couple of $100. And it isn't doing them any favours. So they're not being realistic in what they want. So for every 5 applications by a landlord, there's 1 by a tenant. And rent arrears is always the highest one. So you see the spike before COVID, then the dip, and then the curve line is going in the other direction. There's no doubt. It's certainly, everyone feels it. Whether you're a landlord or whether you're a tenant, you have been impacted by this cost of living. So what is happening with rents? This is what's happening with Wanganui compared to the rest of with Auckland. It's a fascinating trend that what we've seen. Rents traditionally increase roughly 4 to 5% per annum every year. The only time where we've gone through a flat period where we've had 0 rent growth is in the late 90s, where it's flatlined. We have seen situations, one-offs, where we have seen drops of rents, and I'm going to show you an example of that in a moment. But typically, Auckland has been relatively consistent. It dipped a little bit around COVID when a lot of students went overseas, and then you're left with a big apartment market. But what you saw in the provinces was there was a move from the cities, people wanting to move out to get a lifestyle. And you can see this in Wanganui. Round about the end of 2017, that's when Labour got in. I'm not saying that, but is there a correlation there? I don't know, because you have to think of the things that have been put on landlords as well, such as the letting fee, which used to be paid by the tenant. That's paid by the landlord. I would say rightfully so, by the way. You've got healthy homes, which is additional costs. Now we have things such as interest deductibility. Chris will be able to talk more and more about that. But you can see also that we've seen a reduction of supply, and rents have pushed up significantly. So the gap, which was quite wide a while ago, and I could show this slide not just for Wanganui, but for Palmerston North, for Napier, for Hastings, for Timaru, all very, very similar. The provinces have seen rents far increase ahead of Auckland. Now, Auckland makes up 1/3 of our rental market. So if you look at nationwide, rents have increased by 7-8% nationwide. You have to take into account that Auckland's only been going about 4%. So that means the provinces we've seen on our rent rolls across the country double-digit growth, which is significant. The other thing to take into account is the amount of bonds. So what we've got here, actually this is, I've got the slides a little bit in the wrong order, sorry. We'll go to this one first, is the bonds. So what the other thing I like to measure, you can measure how many bonds are being lodged and how many bonds are active. So the data that you get from rents, it's a little bit inaccurate sometimes. It's because Tenancy Services only gets it from when a bond has been lodged. And it's a very archaic manual process. You know, the property manager or your landlord will sign the bond, the tenant signs the bond, it's lodged, and the money's sent to Tenancy Services, and then someone gets that bond form and inputs data into a computer, which gives you your rents. And if you go to Tenancy Services, which I'm sure most of you would have done at some stage to have a look at what's happening with rents, it comes off that data. What people don't seem to measure is bonds and what's happened with bonds. Again, please note the coincidence between the levelling off of bonds compared to the rents. The bond numbers have been going up and then they've flatlined, but the rents have continued. Is that just the basics of economics, supply demand? I don't know. That's what I think. Right? You've seen that level drop. And what we've got, the other slight line we've got is a trend line, which I try and give as a prediction. And you've got 30 years of data here now from Tenancy Services, so there's enough data to go off. And this is why I referred to Moneyball at the beginning to what we've got now. This is an industry which too often we get caught up in the emotions about, oh, this person's should fix the tap, it's their responsibility, whatever. The industry is about data. A landlord is going to spend roughly $1,200 a year on repairs and maintenance. We can see that from the amount of money that comes through the tradies. Right? And what we're trying to do eventually is break it down by age of property, style of property. So again, we can make more informed decisions to you guys so you can plan ahead. Now, this is an example I want to show what happens with supply and demand. And Christchurch post the earthquake. So again, Christchurch, a steady increase. You see those little pyramids? That's the student market. So that's the bonds being lodged round about January, February. You're typically going into 5, 6 bedrooms. The rents are higher because they're in a flatting situation. And my son is heading to Christchurch next year and we've got him a flat. And so I'm going through all this and you can see what they have to go through. The earthquake happens, you can see. And then you get this shortage of supply. And what happens? The rents increase quite dramatically. But then a few years later, it slows down. And it actually starts to drop a little bit. That's the rebuild. Now, what National did, I think it was Jerry Brownlee, who was the earthquake minister, they made the council release all this land that was going to be staggeredly released over a 30-year period. He says, right, release this now so people can get on with their lives, they can get the claims, we can get the rebuild going. And I have to say, you know, I don't know how often you get to Christchurch. I get down there quite a bit. I think Christchurch, well, it's just about the best city in New Zealand. In terms of value for money with rents and whatever, it's an infrastructure. It's really, really good. And you saw rents level out because they actually had an oversupply of property. So the basis of my argument is you get enough property built, you know, that's your housing crisis. The issue is, politically, all the loopholes you've got to get through, and then you've got to find sufficient supply of material, and then you've got to find enough builders to do it. So I haven't got the solutions, you know, otherwise I'll get into politics, I suspect, who knows. Anyway, but this just gives you an indication of what happened. So from 2002 to 2011, average increase, median increase, 5% per annum. Between February 2011 to July 2014, nearly 11%. So it doubles because of the shortage. Then the rebuild has kicked in, increased then over a 7-year period of 0.37%. So if you take into account inflation, rents have actually gone backwards. And over that period of time, the combined, it mirrors what's happened nationwide. Really interesting stuff. Well, I think it's interesting. I don't know. But I'm a bit of a train spotter when it comes to this type of stuff. What we're working on as a company. So we recognise, and this is a fault of our industry. So sometimes rent increases, we're inconsistent with them. And I'll admit that some of our property managers, you know, the tenants themselves, some are solo parents, and they can sometimes empathise with tenants. And when it comes to doing rent reviews, sometimes we're not always we're inconsistent. And that's an industry trend. So what we've done, we've partnered with a company called Velocity. Now, Velocity do a lot of... Have we got karaoke next door?
Sounds like it.
Maybe crack us a few songs later on. Yeah. So what we've done is we've started to build an automated rental valuation. So this taps into about 150,000 rent payments a week through a software called Palace. All right, so the data's protected, but they can see all the transactions that come through. And what this has been able to do, and it's not quite ready to be released, but we've been working on it, it's been able to give us an automated valuation as to what the market's doing compared to what rent is doing. And then what we're going to be able to do is go to owners when it comes up to when rent review time is due and almost automate the process. It's still the landlord's decision. And we see a lot of landlords who don't want to increase rents because they have good tenants. Now, I've just written an article on this because we've had a case in Wairoa, where a market rent case where a landlord has got 14 properties and he's come off a very low interest rate onto a very high interest rate. And he's hit these tenants with about a 25% rent increase. Now, I think that even if they're below market rent, I find that unfair on the tenants because the tenants should be able to plan their lives and budget accordingly. Right. So that's unique and that's coming soon. The other thing which I feel is going to happen in the industry is we're going to see more and more green policies come into what we do in all aspects of life. You'll see it everywhere. And typically when I talk to landlords about, the climate, whatever, the eyes roll. I get it. You know, I don't suffer from climate anxiety. I don't. I'm still going to drive around in my car. I like roads, you know, but I can see where we're heading. And in Europe, we have what's called the... I say we, you know, but I don't live there anymore, but what they have is a energy performance certification. Now, I think we will see something similar gradually introduced over time in New Zealand. Now, in terms of the energy performance certification, at the moment, grading below E, you cannot rent it out. They're changing rules to increase it to C and above. So things like, if I follow the UK news for obvious reasons, but also because what happens there kind of happens here. And we're seeing things like, you know, Scotland wants to ban gas boilers. Yeah, it's all types of implications. And they have these things called ULEZ, which is ultra low emission zones. And it's become very, very political because it's impacting how people live their lives and driving cars. But you can see the trends where we're heading. So that's going to take into effect in the UK on the 1st of April 2025 for all new tenancies. The risk is you may have ghost houses where people will just go, well, we're not going to rent these out. We can't rent them out because we're breaking the law. And that makes the housing crisis even worse. So these are the things that we have to take consideration with as to what we're doing. Now, we did a survey. Now, if you can scan, if you're all techie and whatever, you can scan that QR code and it'll take you to the landing page. And we did this survey of about 350 odd landlords. And in that, we asked them the question, would you want to know the emissions of your rental property? Results are quite stark, but it actually didn't surprise me. We had a 50-50 split as to landlords who wanted to and landlords who didn't. 80% of landlords under the age of 40 did. 80% of landlords over the age of 40 didn't. And that's your generational gap. Now, from a business perspective, I and collectively, we as a team, have to future-proof our business going forward. The reality is, in 20 years' time, our landlords are going to be under 40 now. That's the reality. And what we're doing with a company who's partnering, who are a sister company to Velocity, who are called Generate Zero, we've got this, and I've got this theory, and we've thrown a bit of money at it, and we think it's got legs. We're going to start, we've actually already started, but we're measuring the emissions of our properties. We provide data of the property to this company called Generate Zero, and they're able to tell us what the emissions are. And eventually we'll have a portal for landlords where we can give recommendations to landlords where they can obtain green loans at 1%. And we can say, you can get quotes to do double glazing, solar panel, to try and bring the emissions down. Now, the theory I have is that lower emission properties will achieve higher rents and will be worth more. That's a theory. All right? We're not going to make it complete. We can't. But I'm just trying to foresee where the future is going to take us. What the future looks like, this is my last slide, then you can get into your food and we can crack a song on the old karaoke after a few beers. I've known to do a good Tom Jones. Impact on legislation and future lifestyle changes. So regulation of the property management industry. That's coming. What does that mean? It means there's going to be more properties professionally managed by fewer companies. I saw this guy in Australia and he has this theory, and I didn't believe him at the time, but now I'm going to see where it comes from. He said it's going to be like Bunnings and Mitre 10. Big players will buy up the small players. The small players will not be able to cope with regulation, and we'll see a consolidation of the industry. I wouldn't mind seeing a landlord register. You know, there's apparently there's over 600,000 rental properties in New Zealand, but there's only 400,000 bonds lodged. So there's 200,000 properties. Where are they? And the government has got no idea how many rental properties there are. No one knows how many are managed. There's this theory there's about 42% of houses are professionally managed. But no one knows. And with that, you can make better decisions. So green policies have highlighted are going to impact. And just a show of hands, who thinks tenants should be allowed pets? I do. I do. Not everybody does. Pets in rentals. We are seeing a trend in tribunal where adjudicators are throwing out cases where I've got a pet clause in my tenancy agreement because there's nothing in the RTA that states you can say to a tenant you can't have pets. It's classified as an unlawful clause. Now, it needs to be tested, and there's only a handful of adjudicators who are ruling on it, but that could be a trend that we see. We're going to have a bit of Q&A later on with Chris and myself at the end of the night. Thanks for coming out on what night is it? It's Tuesday, isn't it? Yeah, get lose track. And stay around for a drink, and there's food at the back, and you'll get great value out of Chris Pedersen in a bit. Okay, cheers guys, thank you.
So a bit of a intro on myself. My probably story in regards to this probably starts a bit over 20 odd years ago. I was a kid at university, probably doing what most people at that stage were, racking up a student loan and spending too much of it at the student pub. And a mate took me along to a property investment seminar, and it probably kind of changed my life. As much as you'll hear from some people that the tax rules and everything are basically stacked in favour of property investors these days, the rules back then were absolutely fantastic. So for some of those, there's a couple of grey hairs in the room will remember back then, it really was a great time to be a property investor. So I kind of jumped straight into that in my basically early 20s. And kind of get into both kind of buy and hold and trading. Realised very quickly I was better with a calculator than a hammer. I think rather than adding value, I probably kind of subtracted value from the houses I renovated, and kind of just realised that I was better to kind of start in finance. And so I decided I wanted to kind of jump into learning all the kind of nifty ways to basically do kind of property deals. And so I started working for a non-bank lender. And while I'll talk a bit about non-bank lenders a little bit later, It was a different basically world basically back then. We were lending up to 112% of the property values. So as an example, if you're buying a second-hand property now, as most of you will know, you need a 35% deposit. We were doing 112%. And to give you as a comparison with the banks were doing 100% back, basically lending back then on investment properties as well. That might be why we had something called the global financial crisis. That might have kind of caused a little bit of it. But in regards to, I suppose, where I learned a lot of lessons going through the GFC. I think, in my opinion, as investors, you often learn more through the downtime than basically when the market's going up. And kind of we definitely had a bit of a rocky road through there. Managed to make it to the other side, and have kind of grown a fair bit since then. So we're the main principal sponsors of both the Auckland and the Northland Property Investors Association. I feature actually alongside Mr. Faulkner in regards to the Property Investment Magazine, talking about interest rates and basically kind of mortgage, property investment commentary and stuff like that. So what I want to do, I suppose, in regards to preparing for the rebound tonight is have a bit of a talk about maybe where we've been for the last few years, kind of how I believe we're kind of where we've got to where we are now, and maybe how I see things kind of moving forward a bit. So apologies, some of the numbers might be a little bit small, but I'll try and walk you through them. So I'm going to use a theoretical couple called Joe and Mary, and I'm going to take you back to kind of February 2020, before we actually were talking to, 2020, before we were talking too much about something called COVID. So back then, let's say they've got $110,000 combined income, a couple of kids, they've got their personal home with no mortgage on it, they've got a couple of rental properties with $1 million debt, which they're renting out for $1,000 a week, and the mortgage that they've got is on an interest rate of 3.6%, and they've taken that mortgage out of 10 years ago. Now basically we've then gone into COVID, and what we saw prior to that, this is a bank affordability calculator. Now I want to kind of run through a few of these with you over the next little while, and what we find with investors, a lot of people are getting frustrated at the moment because they're looking at potential property deals going, we can afford them. What they're on the other side not realising is that banks have got their own way of basically working the numbers. So this is an actual bank calculator back in 2020, how they would look at kind of Joe and Mary. So effectively what they take is their net income. They would then basically take the rental income, put that into a monthly basis, and take 75% of it, which comes out to about $10,700 a month. Then on the expenses side, they take out living expenses. And back then what they would do is they would take the mortgage amount and put it through a test rate. Now the test rate back then was about 6.65%, and even though Joe and Mary were paying the mortgages on an interest-only basis, the banks always test everything as if you've got to pay principal and interest. So they put it all through that, look at basically the bank's version of the income, take away the expenses, and the great news kind of back then for Joe and Mary is that they had a surplus of about $1,300 a month. So we've now gone into COVID, and we've ended up in this situation that for most of you, if you're kind of messing around in the property investment market, you'll probably remember all the commentators coming out and talking about how property prices were going to go falling through the floor. And so what happened is the Reserve Bank, who regulates all the banks, basically started putting a huge amount of stimulus on the market. They printed a lot of cash, they drove the official cash rate, which has a massive effect on interest rates, through the floor to the lowest ever, basically a number of 0.25%, and they removed the loan-to-value rules. So for those of you who aren't sure what I mean by loan-to-value rules, that's the percentage that the banks are able to lend on properties. So effectively what happened, suddenly the banks were able to lend back to a much higher amount on investment properties overnight. Now moving forward a little bit, what we also saw was the Reserve Bank decided to put more stimulus on the market. They started talking about taking the official cash rate negative. The only reason they didn't do it is none of our banks had the technology to be able to handle it. So literally back then what they did is they gave all of the banks a December 2020 deadline of having their technology ready, because the plan was to push the OCR actually basically kind of sub-zero at that stage, and it has happened overseas. What they also did was print a lot more money, and they created something called the Funding for Lending program, where they could effectively lend money directly to the banks at the official cash rate. Now some of you who might be in the construction industry or have done new builds in the last while might remember ASB or ANZ coming out with very attractive build products, and that was effectively created on the back of the Funding for Lending program. So then what we saw was these very low rates. We ended up with basically a one-year rate hitting kind of 2.09%. At the same time as we had very low interest rates, we had the government, probably correctly in some ways, trying to counteract basically an out-of-control property market. We had Labor incorrectly remove interest deductibility. and we saw them basically put back onto the banks harder lending criteria in regards to rental investment. So we saw it basically within a very short period of time go from the banks were lending 80% on second-hand investments, basically back to 70, back to 60%. And obviously we've only seen that relaxed basically back to 65 relatively shortly. So if we kind of now look at Joe and Mary, and we're now kind of basically moving forward to mid-21. And at this stage here, we've got like interest rates at their absolute lowest. This is when basically interest rates were kind of 2.19%. Now in their situation, as per a lot of people around the country, they've received income increases. Because what's happened, of course, we haven't had people coming into the country, so we started to see incomes in most industries start to rise. So as a couple, their income's gone up, but also at the same time what's happened is the cost of their debt has gone down. So they're feeling pretty good from a cash flow point of view. So what they decide to do, because of the removal of the interest deductibility, is maybe add another property to their portfolio. And what we saw with a lot of investors is everyone started to look at new builds because of that change to the rules. So they've decided to look at a $500,000 property, which they can rent out for $400 a week, and they can borrow this at an interest rate of under 2% because there are these amazing beneficial build products in the market at the time. Now looking at basically the calculators at this stage, again, banks were basically taking net income from their earnings into account. They were scaling the rent, but taking that into consideration. One of the big changes was the test rate the banks were using. So as interest rates dropped, it went from that 6.65% that they were assessing all of their debt at pre-COVID, and test rates with the banks dropped down to kind of that 5.5 to 5.8 region. The good news for basically Joe and Mary back then, they're wanting to buy a property and they're passing the criteria, so they get a tick, they can go buy that. Now basically what happens very shortly after mid-2021 is the big inflation monster basically appears. And globally no one really kind of saw this happening, especially all the central banks around the world. So what we basically saw was in New Zealand the regulators started to tighten everything up. We ended up with triple CFA. Has anyone heard of triple CFA in the room? Okay, so the government effectively ran triple CFA through. Some of you may have heard the name Cameron Bagrie, who's quite a well-known economist. I was having a talk to him and he basically said there was a working group in Wellington, not a single person who worked in finance, and what that is, they got together and they made up these rules and they pushed them through. What it effectively did, it made it almost impossible to borrow through the banks for a period of time. So as an example, some of the things that we saw was if you were regularly saving, so we had clients, for example, who were saving $5,000 a month to buy their first home, basically the banks were taking that savings as an expense and they were declining people on their mortgage applications because of their regular savings. Does that sound like common sense to you? This is what happens when you put people who've got no idea what they're doing and kind of create the rules. So we end up in a situation that basically the banks became very, very hard to deal with, and we ended up, that put a lot of pressure on the non-bank market. The non-bank market then ended up kind of basically running out of cash almost overnight purely because of the demand that was put on them. So I remember kind of going into the back end of 2021, literally it was probably the most crazy kind of finance market I've ever seen. Banks were exceptionally difficult to deal with. Non-banks are basically out of money. The property market's still going up, and basically it literally hit the end of 21, we go into 2022 and it starts tanking. And that's simply because I think the supply capital of credit wasn't there anymore. So now if we look at Joe and Mary, and we kind of fast forward to mid last year. Now they've still received another pay bump, they're now up to 130k, because of course if we go back to last year, most people were receiving some type of pay increase, because again we'd had that country that had been in lockdown, there was basically a shortage of people in the country, so people were receiving pay increases. The $1 million loan, however, has now been pushed up to an interest rate of 5.35, but interest rates have been increasing since about October 21. Now they're now feeling a bit more cash flow pressure because their interest rates across their portfolio are a lot higher, so they go back to the bank and kind of want to keep their loans on interest only because they've been coming off the end of their interest only term. Now what we started to see happening with a lot of investors is that the banks were qualifying people on their current criteria. If you didn't meet the current criteria, they would force you to principal and interest. Now again, this is a case of common sense. I can walk you through this. What the banks are effectively saying back then is we're going to put you through a full application process, and if you can't basically meet our current criteria, we're going to make you pay more. It doesn't really make sense. So we suddenly started to see quite a few investors get put under quite a bit of pressure because of these rules. And again, this has been enforced on the banks. I won't beat the banks up, it's more the regulators behind the scenes. So, in regards to the bank calculators, this is kind of how it would look for Joe and Mary. Net income again, but what we had was basically the banks went through a period where they were taking a lower amount of the rental into account, again because of rules that were enforced on them. The test rate started to increase. So basically at this stage last year, that test rate, which as I said earlier had dropped down to about 5.5%, 5.8%, has now moved up to 7.6%. And so the banks, as it moves up, that decreases basically what Joe and Mary's borrowing capacity is. Suddenly they can't meet criteria, they're getting their ability to stay on interest only declined, they were getting pushed onto making principal interest repayments. Now, to give you a bit of an idea how the cash flow effect works when you go from IO or interest only to principal interest, let's say you've got a couple of $1 million of debt on a 30-year term on a 6.5% interest rate, and you effectively, so you can see here it's about $11,000 a month. If you move that from interest only to principal interest, that's another couple of $1,000s a month. What we started to see though is a lot of the older investors have maybe been buying for quite a period of time. And what happens when you've got a shorter loan term that goes from interest only to principal interest, the payment jump becomes a lot higher. So you can see here, again, the interest only is the same if you've only got 15 years remaining on your loan term. But if you get moved on to principal and interest at this stage, you're going to have to pay $7,000 more a month. Not many people have a spare $7,000 sitting around, and this was what was happening to investors at the same time as we've got basically increased living costs, as we've got things like the interest deductibility changes, and there started to be quite a bit of pressure on households. So, Joe and Mary's situation, they're starting kind of from a period back here where they're paying $3,000 a month. They're getting pushed to a period of paying a bit over $9,000 a month. You can see here, more than $70K a year, additional basically payments required. So what we started to see was probably people in two situations. We started to see more people, I suppose, on what I'll call struggle street. And there have been some people, I suppose, who've been sitting there waiting, more the older investors who've been kind of waiting for this period of time, what I'll call opportunity Ave. Now, a bit of a talk in regards to struggle street initially. Right now, the Reserve Bank records some data, and if we look at the whole New Zealand economy as a household, the average interest rate is about 5.3%. So that's adding up all the basically mortgages through the banks basically out there, it's 5.3. Now, a key factor is that's expected to increase to about 6.2 by June next year. So it's quite hard, and this, I suppose, is the fight that's going on behind the scenes at the moment. The Reserve Bank, of course, increases interest rates to try and rein in inflation. At the same time, they've been pretty honest about it. They're going to increase basically unemployment rate, and they're going to cause some pain in basically doing it because they had to rein the economy in. So the real, I suppose, kind of key factor we're going to have to keep an eye on over the next 12 months is the unemployment rate and basically how the inflation numbers basically stack up. What we're starting to see behind the scenes is that the bank arrears numbers are starting to increase. They've come from a really low base. Like, it's really low. This is nothing to like the GFC. As a property investor, I got prepared from being the idiot who was far too geared in the GFC. This time I thought I'd rub my hands, get ready, and I thought there'd be some amazing buying coming into the cycle. It's nothing like the GFC. I saw an article recently that in regards to Trade Me stats, there was only 30 properties around the country for mortgagee sale. In the GFC, there was 3,000 basically on Trade Me for mortgagee sale at the same time. Big difference in regards to numbers. So we're not going to see the same pain, but I do think basically over the next 6 to 12 months, you'll see some more pain come through. So for those of you who might be feeling, I suppose, a cash flow pinch a little bit, there's a few things I suppose I want to say that you should potentially do. Review your mortgages. I suppose it's more important than ever to have a look. We're finding a lot of people aren't necessarily aware of the numbers of their cash flow, aware of basically maybe the hit they're going to have when they come off an interest rate in the 3s or 4s and come out into like a 6 or 7. Check your numbers. Be very, very aware of your fixed rates when they're coming off. Run a realistic budget, basically, including the fixed rate reviews, your interest-only expiry dates. I'll talk a bit more about interest-only in a second, but you want to have an understanding. If you're going to be moved from interest-only to principal interest, can you afford it? Interest deductibility changes, and I mean, have a talk to your accountant, make sure you've got a good accountant. Hopefully we'll have a government change. I'll talk a bit more about that in a second. But we are talking to a lot of accountants who are quite concerned that their clients aren't aware of how much that could basically affect them at end of year tax time. So some things which may help, some banks are relaxing interest only criteria. So I spoke before about Joe and Mary's kind of concerns and issues they went through. While we had pretty much all of the banks being difficult for most of last year, we've started to have some of the banks adopt a more common sense position. So while they're probably still asking for a full application process from you, you may not be able to meet the criteria, but they're still actually going to let you kind of extend your interest only because they understand otherwise they're going to cause massive issues. Be aware that not all banks are doing that. Some banks are forcing customers onto making principal payments. You may be able to extend the loan terms out. So if you remember a few slides back, I kind of did the comparison between a 15-year P&I term and a 30-year P&I term. Again, if the bank sits here and says you have to pay principal, see if there's an alternative to let you extend the term back out, because that will bring your payments down. Now, another option is non-banks, and there's all types of non-bank solutions. Towards the end of the presentation, I'll give a couple of examples of deals that we've done recently. But be aware that if you're feeling a bit of a pinch, there may be options there which can be used to relieve some pressure. We have had cases where clients have taken a non-bank option at a higher interest rate who will let you go interest only rather than staying at a bank who forces you to principal interest. That's because the payments are lower. So what do we think in regards to 2024 and the back end of 2023 as well? Property sales volumes and prices to increase. I suppose I look at a couple of things that's taken off ANZ economists. If we look at basically the last kind of couple of years, you can see the property prices getting absolutely out of control 2020, 2021, and you can see them falling through the floor. Note this little outlier right here, that's basically June. So we've started to see a tiny little bounce back, and I did not expect that in the middle of winter. I literally expected basically around kind of June, July, August this year to be blood on the floor carnage. Normally right before an election, markets are completely dead. And there's, and middle of winter with everything, that was quite surprising to see. Tony Alexander, well-known economist, basically runs a survey alongside Ryan's, and this is basically where people believe prices are going. Similar situation in regards to July, you've got the first signs of people expecting prices to rise. So a bit of positivity coming through. So next thing is, I do think, especially over the next kind of 6, 12, 18 months, we'll see more lending criteria relax. Especially in regards to the loan to value ratios, I'd expect that 65% that you can borrow against an existing investment property to probably pop up at some stage to at least 70. I think there will be other relaxing as well in regards to what I was saying before about the triple CFA. I was in a room with a senior banker last week, and he says they're trying to find little ways around some of these rules, which they're trialling on some clients basically at the moment. So I do think that we'll see some more relaxing. I am a bit concerned about this man. Anyone know who that is? Yeah, because I look at kind of what he's done basically, the property market and the general economy. Come April next year, has anyone heard of debt to incomes? Yeah, so effectively from April next year, he has the ability to use debt to incomes. So the banks have been given until then to get their systems basically in order. I won't bore you too much for those of you who don't understand what I mean by debt to incomes. But for the last 10 years, the banks have effectively had loan to value restrictions put on them, so an equity-based restriction. Debt to incomes is an affordability-based restriction. Now, part of me actually thinks that's a better way because we don't go broke on equity, we go broke on cash flow. So I can understand some common sense around it. What I don't like is that he keeps comparing it to the UK. The UK doesn't use debt to incomes on investment property. Because if we look at what debt to incomes do, they take into account your living expenses. If I go buy an investment property, I don't have another set of living expenses each time I buy a property. So this is more political because what they want to do is, this is more politics trying to slow down property investment. So keep an eye on basically him. Nicola Willis and David Seymour aren't big fans. So we'll see how that basically plays out if there is a change of government. Expect more stories around business failure and also, property, forced property sales. I think while we might have positive stories in regards to prices being better, I'm expecting still a lot of basic businesses to fall over, especially in the construction market. Interest rates at some stage next year should start reducing. When exactly that's going to happen, hard to say. My pick is roughly around the middle of next year. We'll start to see the OCR reduce, but there's a lot of water that needs to go under the bridge. Things overseas could basically bring that forward, push that back. We've got to see basically how things like inflation plays out, where unemployment goes and all that kind of stuff. But roughly at some stage next year, I think if we see interest rates reducing, that will have a very positive flow-on effect to the property market. What we noticed in our business, it was pretty quiet dealing with investors back into last year through to around kind of April. As soon as the Reserve Bank basically said in May that they thought the interest rates or the official cash rate was peaked, we started to see a pickup in activity. So I think if there's another sign basically that says that they're going to push the official cash rate down, I think that will push basically more people into the market as well. Now, I suppose looking at the official cash rate to give you an idea, I suppose how violent the increase has been. If we look basically back at the GFC, you can see this here, where across 2008 and 2009, we saw the official cash rate basically brought down 5.75%. Across the last 18 months or so, we've had the opposite, where it's been pushed up 5.25. That's a huge increase. So, I mean, we're hoping basically this is going to be enough of a rise. There is some commentators coming out thinking there might be one more increase next year. And the markets have priced in about a 40% chance of another 0.25% increase. So be aware there might be one more nudge, but I think that we're pretty close to the top. So I think it's pretty obvious a change in government will be positive for the property market. A mate of mine who's an accountant in Auckland, a guy called Matthew Gilling, came up with this little chart here. Might be a bit hard for you to read, but this is his version of, I suppose, all the taxes in regards to him rating all the political parties. Now, he's in the process though, he may actually give National a worse score. And the reason he might give National a worse score is who in the room has basically heard of National repealing the interest deductibility? Anyone? Okay. What it sounds like they're going to do is they're going to scale it back. So rather than just pulling it straight off, they may slowly scale it back. So we're trying to push on this behind the scenes at the moment, because the impression we had is that they would literally just pull the rule back maybe kind of April 1 next year. It's a lot harsher, or a lot harder on investors if they suddenly kind of pull it back basically at the same rate that it was put on. So just keep an eye on that, and if you can, put a bit of pressure on your local MP, because that's going to have quite an effect on people's pockets. So in regards to the opportunity side of the street, what are we seeing? It's very similar, I suppose, to what I was saying in regards to if you're on the struggle side. Still review your borrowing. I've had far too many people coming to me going, we can see the opportunities, we can see there's going to be a change in government in all probability, we can see there might be some good buys. We want to basically get ready to basically get in there and have a look at what's there. And we're going, okay, are you aware that you've got all this debt coming off, moving to this? They've got no idea. So to go through a kind of full review of your own numbers first. You don't want to take on more debt and then find you can't service basically your existing debt and move yourself over to the struggle side of the street. Go through all your numbers, make sure that you're in a good position before you go taking on more debt at the moment. And one point I will actually raise that we see far too many investors not do is release properties when you can. So what I mean by this, and I'll talk more about this in a second, is banks are very, very good at cross-securing everything together. So they make it very, very easy to, if you bring one property to them, they'll leverage off that and let you kind of keep basically growing your portfolio. We see a lot of clients who might have quite large portfolios, but are geared very lowly with low amounts of debt, and they could actually drop properties out and keep them completely unencumbered. What we're seeing now, when we've gone through a period where finance is tighter, the bank's got every single property together, and if they go sell a property, and if they can't meet the current criteria, the bank can take all of the sale proceeds and apply it to the existing bank debt. What we recommend you do if you've got a lowly geared portfolio, try and drop your properties out. So basically, if you sell it, you get all the cash, you can spend on whatever you want. Does that make sense? And it's just worth understanding that, because the banks used to look at your position if you had more than one property with them. If you sold a property, they would allow you to basically keep debt up to whatever the current LVR rules were. Now they're putting you through a full application process and you have to meet their current servicing rules. If they don't, they're going to do that to you. So be careful. So there's something kind of called the one bank trap, and this is, I spoke before about Matthew Gilligan, he taught me this in the middle of the GFC. Again, repeating that, we see a lot of people who give too much to one bank. We're a big proponent of split banking, especially ideally keeping your personal home away from your rental properties. So what we see is a lot of people start off with a personal home, decide they want to get into property investment, Bank sits there and says, we'll 100% finance you into that, and they repeat the process. Behind the scenes, they're cross-securing everything together. So what we recommend doing instead is along this side. One second. So let's say you've got a family home worth $500,000. Let's say, you've got a $200K mortgage. So that means you've got $300,000 equity. Now, you can't basically access all of that $300K. You can generally borrow 80% of the value of your home. So 80% of $500K is $400,000. $400,000 minus a $200K mortgage is effectively the unutilised equity that you can use basically for investments, top-ups, whatever you basically want to do. So what we recommend is you have that with basically Bank A. Then what we're basically doing is going to a second bank, Bank B, should we call it, and you're looking to basically get them to provide the remaining money, and that's where they're going to take basically property number 2 as security. You're ideally leveraging your own home, taking as little deposit as possible, and you're taking the maximum from Bank 2. In this case here, the properties aren't cross-secured together. So maximum debt always on the rentals, minimum debt basically on your home. And what we look to continually do is, as the loan-to-value rules can relax over time, we push more debt onto the rentals, bring it back into your home. So I mentioned earlier, going back to COVID, there was a period where the loan-to-value rules were basically completely removed. We were jamming all the debt basically then kind of onto the rentals and pulling it back in. It was a much better position for clients, enables them to be able to keep moving forward. The clients who kept everything at one bank, they couldn't use that additional equity. So make sure that you also if you're going to continue with new builds based on the current loan-to-value rules, make sure you split bank your new builds. So what happens is if you're buying a new build, you can generally leverage that to 80% because of the exemptions. The day after you settle on it, it's not a new build anymore. So it's basically the loan-to-value that you can borrow and it's dropped. So again, what we see is people maybe kind of buy that because they think they can get good leverage on it, but as soon as it's basically settled, the banks can only lend to 65% on it. Park that basically away from the rest of your, I suppose, property investment activities, so it doesn't pull down the amount of equity that you can use. So what solutions are there out there if the bank basically isn't kind of really a good fit for you? And I mentioned to someone in the room a little bit earlier, I suppose if you look at our business, probably 3 years ago, we're only doing about 5% in the non-bank market. And what's happened, I think, with a combination of over-regulation, I suppose just all the changes we've gone through, is that probably as a business now we're probably 30% non-bank. And that's just simply because in a lot of cases we can't get the kind of the money through the banks. It's always our way to go first because of cost, but there are basically other options out there for those who can't access bank money. So if you look at the non-bank market, and I suppose this kind of goes back to what I was doing kind of pre-GFC, you can see here that there was a pretty, at that stage there, it was a reasonably sizable amount of non-bank lending. What happened with the GFC, you can see the slump here, where almost nothing was done. And I think at the moment we're sitting somewhere in the region of about 1.5% of the whole mortgage market is through the non-banks, but I think it's about 10% of new lending is going through non-banks. And if you look at other countries, which we tend to kind of copy a little bit or follow is a better word, Australia, they've got a much stronger non-bank market than what we do. So this is basically here to stay. Don't look at the non-bank market as being dirty. It's going to continue to grow. There's more and more participants kind of coming in because they can see how regulated the New Zealand market is, and you're going to see more and more solutions come in to kind of fit that hole.
Just a quick question, why is the Australian non-bank market so much better than New Zealand?
The Australian regulators and government backed the non-bank market, ours didn't really guarantee the non-banks that well. So the non-banks were basically slaughtered. So yeah, you've got a lot of lenders in Australia who basically carry the whole way through. We don't. So we literally hit 2016, which is the bottom here, and we had very, very little non-bank activity going on. We started to see players come back in. We pretty much hit COVID, which is here, and it started ratcheting up, and it's continued to ratchet up as I've said, over-regulation's kind of come in. You can kind of see that kind of going up, and that I think will continue to grow quite aggressively. What's kind of again stupid, a huge amount of this here is funded through the banks. So Westpac, as an example, was probably the strongest funder of the non-bank market in New Zealand. Those lenders you can do things through that you won't be able to do through Westpac. So a couple of quick non-bank case studies, and then I'll basically kind of pass it on. So this is a couple of real deals that we've done relatively recently. This is a case of a pretty strong client if you look at them. Household income of about 300k. They had about 16 mil of total property and about $3.5 million of mortgage debt. Good, position overall to be in. Most of their debt was on good rates, but it was on short terms. So what I mean by that, they've taken the mortgages out, they've had them for a long period of time, and those terms have reduced over a period of time. They wanted to be in a position to buy. They're kind of counter-cyclical investors. They wait to this type of the cycle to kind of get back in. So this is before some of the relaxing in the bank rules, but that's an idea of the analysis we have to do behind the scenes. It's got a lot more intense than it used to be, and this is a bit of a snapshot of one bank. So what we have to basically look at from a client, you've got at one bank, all those numbers on the left, for those of you who can see it, that's the loans they've got with the bank. Next column through is the actual rate they're paying at the bank. What they've got, as you can see there quite clearly, they've only got 9 years remaining before the loan expires. We tried to extend the term out, the bank wouldn't let us do so. So what we've effectively got, and that particular bank was testing the client at a rate of 8.75. So they're not going to charge them. It's a bit similar to my Joe and Mary example. What they're doing is they're taking these mortgages, they're testing them at a rate of 8.75, and they're saying in their mortgage calculator that they've got about $11,500 a month that they're kind of paying on that debt. In reality, because it's all on interest only, the client's only paying $3.5. Can you see the difference in how that can affect affordability? So again, I suppose if we're looking at a bank calculator, what we've got here is the client's net income. We've got their rental income, which effectively, I suppose if you add all that up, they've got about $30,000 a month the bank will take as income. You take off living expenses, you take away how the bank views their mortgages, and the customer's running about 7.5k backwards per month. So no chance for these clients to borrow through a bank at the moment. From a non-bank point of view, we've got non-banks who will look at the actual payments. So they'll look at the actuals on an interest-only basis, they'll look at actuals on the actual rate. So in the $3,500 that they were basically paying, that means that they could service. So this is a case where basically we're funding this client through a non-bank because the client's actually had a couple of unencumbered properties that we can put forward so they can keep buying. They can't qualify for bank finance at the moment. My hope is at some stage in the next kind of 12 months, the banks will relax enough, we can refinance it from non-bank back to bank. This is another quick example of a client who was a bit short on equity. So this particular client was buying a property for $900. They signed the property up shortly before the loan-to-value rules relaxed in June. For those of you who don't know, prior to June, if you were buying an existing property, you had to put a 40% deposit in. That's now relaxed to 35%. So they came to us and they found this great property. They were buying it for $900. They needed to spend $100k on renovations. In regards to the available equity they had in their existing property, they had $290k. To cover the deposit with the bank and the renovation funds all up, they needed $460. So they weren't going to be able to basically bank fund this. It was a great deal, huge cash flow at the end. It was a home and income on 2 properties. So I suppose what we did is we looked at it like this. So as I said earlier, we're always going to try and bank fund a client first, but it doesn't stack up because we can't basically get enough of a deposit out to move them forward. We then had 2 other non-bank options where the non-banks only required 20% deposits. So 20% of 900's 180. Plus 100k they needed for the renovations is 280. They had 290k they could access from their equity. They've got enough with both of these non-banks. Does that make sense? So the next thing is to compare the 2 non-banks and go which one's the best way to move forward. So we had the 2 options. Option 1 was a first mortgage. Option 2 was a combination of a first and a second mortgage. Now the first mortgage interest rate, as you can see, it's definitely on the high side in the 11s. The second one was lending 70% as a first and 10% basically as a second. You can see the interest rate's a bit lower on the first, a lot higher on the second, but the way it worked out from a payment point of view was actually better for them to go down the second option on the right there. Now what we're doing with that client there is how we funded them. They bought the property for $900. It got an as-is value of $920. Now I think it was actually worth more than that, but what happens is the valuer has been aware of the purchase price, so I think he's valued it lower than what it's actually been worth. We got him to do an after renovation value, basically at that stage there, and so you can see he's only got a 2% discount. So, sorry, I've jumped ahead. So you can see here how we funded it. You've got 720k coming from the non-bank lender, 20% or 180k coming basically from the client. The clients then basically put in the 100,000 for the renovation, and so you've got $1 million basically all in at this stage here. Now, what we've got, I suppose, is a total amount of capital in the deal of $1 million and a property which is worth 1.3 at the end. But keep in mind that you'll see you made a 300k amount of equity. Would you guys like 300k in a property deal overall? So he's got 23% overall from the transaction, but the benefit in regards to how we've funded this is that he's still actually only got a mortgage of 720 at this stage. What we're able to do is, we're still waiting for him to renovate this one, he's going through the process now, is we will go back and we can go to a bank at 65% of the after renovation value, we can get him back to a bank. Does that make sense? So while he couldn't basically qualify for a bank at the start, we can use a non-bank to get him through. It's more expensive funding, but at the end, he's going to have a property which he's getting about $3,000 a week rent. I won't explain kind of what he's doing behind the scenes there with emergency housing and stuff like that, but he's also created 300 kind of equity from basically the renovation, buying will, all this type of stuff. So don't be afraid of non-bank lending always. Sometimes it's a kind of a good way to make deals work when you can't access bank funding. So that's me for the moment. I'll be doing more with David shortly.
Well, anything local, Aaron's happy to help out as well. So, are there any questions after today's chat? David, just wondering with that colour software, is that looking at live rent received right as opposed to the
Yeah. So what basically, yeah, you're spot on. So what happens is, and this is the problem with the bonds, it doesn't take into account rent increases. And so the average length of a tenancy now is roughly just over 3 years across, and that's pretty consistent around all our offices. So Velocity have signed, I don't know what they do, but all the privacy is protected on addresses and whatever, but they're able to extract all this live data, so every month it updates so we know exactly what's happening with market rent. So it's still taking into account the bond data. They have an API with the tenancy services for the bond data, but also because Palace will roughly have anywhere between 100 and 150,000 houses under management. So it's got substantial data that it can feed from, so we know it's pretty accurate.
And that'll just run geographically, right?
Yeah, yeah. But what we're also doing to help it is we're starting to put into the software, we're starting to put in the age of the property, the size of the property, so it's able to just look at wherever it gets the information from, it can see all the information from the property and give it more accurate assessment. So they talk about a 15%, it gives you the median. So some properties will be at the lower end of the scale, others may be above. So it just gives you a range. And when we're doing rent reviews, it's going to be based on that, rather than a property manager saying, I think it should be up $10, $15 a week. So that's how that works.
Cool.
My question's to Chris, is it? Yeah. You mentioned that property investment, someone, maybe government, was slowing it down. Why are they slowing it down when we have a housing crisis?
So probably I was talking about the prices there. So I suppose if you go back to 2020, 21, I suppose if you look at what happened with COVID initially, everyone, when I say everyone, that's the wrong way to put it, a lot of the experts, so the economists, the government, Treasury, the Reserve Bank, all expected property prices to crash. What actually happened, I still remember being an advisor in the 2 weeks before the initial lockdown, and we'd had 3 of the 4 main banks in the office basically then coming in and apologising because of how bad their turnaround time was. So we could actually see the demand starting to filter through. I'm sure you could probably remember this as well. And you could actually see the heat coming into the market. So I think they were looking at it going, okay, it's going to fall apart. And what all it did is basically, once people realised that I suppose the sky wasn't going to fall on their head, you push interest rates down. I might be biased because of what I do, but I think kind of cost of credit has a massive effect on the property market. And suddenly you had a pretty hot market, suddenly it's a lot cheaper, that pushed a whole lot of people in. And then I suppose you saw them do different measures to try and slow it down, things like interest deductibility, pushing basically some lending rules basically back on, and it didn't basically work immediately. So the Reserve Bank Governor and the Finance Minister Robertson at the time basically said they were almost going to try and engineer a bit of a property crash because the prices were out of whack. I mean, I don't know kind of what your opinions basically were down here. I don't have my head around the market enough, but they'd gone up far too much in comparison to incomes and stuff like this. So what they did is they pretty much shut the first home buyers out of the market. going back to what I was talking about, the loan to value rules, they pretty much made it that first home buyers were really going to struggle to get in. And then of course what they did is they turned the credit tap off. So if you push interest rates, I suppose in my opinion, there's price of credit and availability of credit. And if you turn the availability off with a lot of the regulations they did and you push the price up, it's going to have a detrimental effect on property prices. And then that's what they did. But you could also see, I suppose, in June this year, they started to show the first signs of relaxing. So we saw them in regards to first home buyers. So the first home buyers, I suppose, if you look at the banks were only able to do 10% of their total lending in that above 80% LVR market, or when you've got less than a 20% deposit. What that is, they increase that to 15% of their total lending in June. And there's definitely more first home buyers who are coming into the market. Looking at the stats, it hasn't actually really been the investors so far. I think the investors are basically all getting pre-approved, as was sitting before, waiting for some good deals. But the first home buyers are coming back in. And so I think part of it was to engineer enough of a crash, because the concern was if you had first buyers come in with low deposits and the market tanked, you could have a lot of people fall over. So they wanted to pull prices back to a reasonable level so people didn't get hurt.
So a hypothetical person wanting to invest, buy property or properties in Wanganui, don't need to take a mortgage out at all, can just pay for it, pay for whatever they want to buy. Okay.
Great position to be in.
Yeah, it is.
Yep.
Well, I hope it is. But my question is, if a person is in that position, what would be maybe the best and worst types of properties in Wanganui to actually invest in?
Is that a question for you?
I suppose that's what you're looking for, really. Look, if you're looking for capital gain, then I suppose you start looking at options of where your highest capital gain may be. If you're looking to exercise the most yield, then I suppose you'd either go for a slightly lower property with a bigger rent. I imagine buying up in St John's Hill, you're not going to get such a great yield for buying a $700,000 home. So it all depends on what you want out of it, I suppose. Some people may, if it were me, and the brokers will know better than me, but if I had $500,000 cash, I'd be probably buying 3 or 4 and go that way instead of buying one, which would make more sense. Financially anyway, from a long-term investment.
What I can tell you is the data we track, we also measure the type of bonds which are being lodged, and predominantly over a third, about 40% in a lot of provincial New Zealand towns, are 3-bedroom housing. So that shows you that there's a strong demand. You know, people are having kids later, or, you know, you've got to get, now divorce becomes a little bit more as well, so they won't, yeah. There's always a high demand for 3-bedroom housing.
Leading on from that, the Brightline has really affected the mum and dad investors, the cash buyers. I think it's really affected them. I saw them fall out of the market overnight. If there's a change of government, is that likely to revert back to 5 years, 2 years, 5 years?
I think National said 2.
Yeah.
Active National had 2, I believe.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's a huge effect on your cash buyer as well, do you think?
Yeah.
If they're looking at the capital gains.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What's the in terms of Brightline, the promise of the right wing to reduce it to 2? Is there any indication of timeline for that? After assuming they,
Everything I know from talking to Seymour wants to do everything on like the first day. National, he does. He's that kind of. National is. I'm a little bit more wary, going back to what I was saying about the interest deductibility.
yes,
Is that there's promises, but I'm not sure.
So if you're
Time
working for the
frames.
government in Wellington, you've got to be pretty nervous.
Yeah.
yeah,
I mean, we had Chris Bishop at a Property Investors Association last year, and he pretty much promised that they were going to roll back all the deductibility then. And then we've seen very different things, or we were hearing very different things recently. So, and then he was put on the spot about exactly that question: how quick will it be done? He answered as any good politician would be, with a whole lot of other technical reasons on why he couldn't give a date.
Are investors coming into the market at the moment, and if so, what sort of yields are they looking for?
Look, yeah, good question. Look, from what I'm seeing in our office anyway, look, I think they are slowly coming back in. We've had some properties saying that say 350 to 450 bracket. So probably maybe 350 to 4, and we're starting to see multi-offers again. So we had one recently, was I think like 4 or 5 on multi-offers we presented. Starting to see probably multi-offers every week now. So I would say, yeah, the investors are. The yields, look, everyone wants, the golden era of 10% 10 years ago is obviously gone, and it's now sort of around, I think, 5-6%, I think is nearly the reality of it all. With rates, Whanganui rates, as you've probably got all in your letterboxes recently, are quite high. Interest rates are really high. So it is difficult to get anything much higher than that. But look, if you can get stuff, ideally, an investor would love 6-7%, but I think the reality is probably somewhere between.
The other thing I'd want to add on to that is factor in, and I've showed it there on the graphs tonight, rent increases. And quite often people, they'll look at it at the moment, they're not taking into account, for... Sorry.
Go.
The rents just went up.
Welcome to Whanganui.
So if you take it into account, on a conservative amount, say 4 or 5% per annum, it's gone up more than that recently, a lot more than that recently. That's not sustainable. I expect that to maybe plateau, because it's dictated to what tenants can afford as much as anything else as well. But if you're looking at it over a long period of time, 4 or 5%, if you look at historical data,
Are the increases a reflection on the location of the property? Like if it was in a good location, is it likely to go up more than...
Yeah, we see strong, what I find, looking again nationwide, in the provinces where we operate, 3-bedroom, big demand. And so quality is a big thing. Tenants are, rightfully, I think, more demanding on the rights, and they expect to have a good, warm, dry... Everyone deserves to live in a warm, dry home. So, yeah, location will have an impact, of course, as well. Phil?
I think we're forgetting one sector of the community here, and that's commercial areas that you might invest in as well. I mean, we're just talking about numbers here which are quite achievable. From the point of view of, I had a deposit of funds of 700, 800. Well, if you're only paying $1 million for a property and you get 75,000 a year, you're doing pretty well, I think, with your thought. So that sort of thing is worth looking at also. We mustn't just hone in on housing.
Yeah, totally, Gil.
Yeah.
Totally. And diversify.
Yeah.
Yeah. Gil works in commercial, by the way.
How's commercial vacancy? Yeah.
Sorry?
How's commercial vacancy overall? Is it okay?
It's not.
You don't have vacancy?
No, there's very little.
Yeah.
Oh, if you want a shop, yeah, that's fine. That's everywhere.
Yeah.
But if you're looking at...
and the industrial will be full.
Industrial.
Yeah.
They're just not there.
Yeah.
And that's why there are parks popping up all over the place.
Yeah.
The offers that are coming in on houses, is there a reflection on the latest government valuations, like the values that are coming in now? Or the offers that are coming in now, is there a reflection on that?
No, not really. Look, I think buyers use a GV to whatever suits their purpose. So it's just the way it is. But no, we're not seeing there's no 10% under GV or 10% over GV scenario. None of that really, and it's going to take. If it did, it would take quite a long time to actually get some sort of data on that at this point. But no, we're not seeing any of that. Seeing multi-offers again, so people are just buying, and it comes down to affordability more than anything really. So I think the old school sort of mentality in regards to rateable value, not GV,
it's gone.
It's gone. It's sort of not too many people focus on that.
I think technology's changed a bit of that. So you can get desktop valuations through core logic and velocity.
Yeah.
So people pay more attention to that now than they will the GV.
Those multi-offers, are they across like first home buyer type properties or
Bit of both. Sometimes they mix. So yeah, look, it's a lot of the first home buyers are in the same sort of posse as the investors, and obviously if you're an investor competing against a first home buyer, an investor's working on facts and figures, a first home buyer's working on emotion. So they tend to pay a little bit more probably than your typical investor. So yeah, they generally intertwine a lot of it. But obviously if they're multi-complexes and stuff, then it's just all investor stuff.
Can I ask a question, Ritesh, and you maybe you as well, Chris? We've seen a lot of towns in New Zealand, the hearts are being taken out of them in terms of retail. Someone made the point before with Gil. Do you reckon we'll ever see a point where we're going to see the demographics of town centres change, where a lot of what was retail, empty office space, converts into residential apartments? Because quite often I just go around Palmies. I see where the Spanish were coming from, but there's a lot of empty office space and retail around Palmy, which could, I think, easily be converted.
Look, from what I'm seeing, and Gil may know, but we're seeing a lot of, like Wanganui, a lot of old properties. So firstly, it's the earthquake proofing can be a mission, but say you're on top of that, apartments are becoming quite popular. The biggest problem though is car parking.
Yeah.
So there's not enough car parking. Most people in regional New Zealand still like to drive their car. Even it might only be 100 metres down the road, but they still like to drive their car. So that's probably our biggest issue in this city, I would say. You're probably all over that as well. But we don't have some big car parking facility, and you're finding in town now, as our population increases, we're probably close to 50,000 people now. 10 years' time, we'll probably be at 55,000 people. So what's going to happen with all those extra people and with all those extra cars? We could all be e-scootering everywhere. David?
No, not scootering. No, not up there.
I think because I live in a city, in an apartment, but I'm lucky enough to have 2 car parks. But we had a meeting the other week with people like living in a city. I think the thing that we need to look at the council, so people get like a parking sticker, so they pay so much a year to have a car park around the city, and like, because around where I live is all the new apartments, none of them have car parks.
Well, they don't want you to have cars, though, do they, anymore? They don't want you to have cars anymore, do they?
Exactly.
People still will,
I know they will. Yeah, I agree.
So they park, and then I see them, they have to get up in the morning and shift their car before the meter before the meter people come, because it's a $40 fine. So whereas if they had paid so much per year, our council's still getting revenue. Totally off what you guys can do, but I'm just saying that's a thing that to promote inner city living could happen.
Yeah.
I find it interesting that if you're living in the suburbs and you're paying rates, you wouldn't have to pay to park on the street. But as soon as you get in town, you have to consider paying for parking on the street. How does that make sense when you're paying rates?
No.
Different conversation there, but
Question for David.
Yeah.
You talked a little bit about the emissions rating of a property.
Yeah.
Were you talking about like a heat loss, or they have a scale?
They have I mean, what we're looking at is like the R value, retention value of the property. So we've got to feed more data from our healthy homes into it, so it gives an estimate, and if people are more interested, then it becomes a little bit more intrusive and they'll get someone round. That's what we're looking at doing. So this is very much in its infancy, and it's pretty big picture stuff, and I don't want to put all this onto the property managers because they've got enough crap to deal with. And
you're basically talking about heat loss with our values,
and they can look at where the house is, where the position is in regards to the sun, so they can see how much sunlight it's getting, and then they'll be able to give a relatively accurate estimate, and then we can go, right, here you go and get a green loan at 1% from whoever, and we could probably factor in a rent increase on that, which would go a long way probably to covering the loan. That's the theory. We'll see how it works in practice once we get there.
Isn't that covered by the healthy homes? Because you've got to have
your
up to a standard anyway.
You do, but it doesn't take it. But healthy homes is just that's a criteria. What we're looking at here is measurement of the performance of a property. The healthy homes has got its flaws. It's got big flaws, and I think it was rushed through. The principal idea of it, I think, is good, But I just think in practice-wise, I've seen houses which the weatherboards are rotten, whatever, but they passed. You know, because someone's gone and done their own assessment. There's no criteria on the people doing the assessments. What we're actually looking at is how a property actually physically performs, rather than looking at 5 criteria, which what the Healthy Homes is. And that'll take into account solar panelling, double glazing, which isn't part of Healthy Homes.
Because the Healthy Homes, a lot of houses had 1.8 insulation, then you had to bring it up to the 3.6, and then the minute you brought it up to that plus the 1.8, you were up to the whatever, but then they changed the rules again. Any new homes now have got to have about 6 points.
And it's and other things that, you know, they got the heating calculation wrong. Yeah. So at the time I was doing a lot of work with Tommy's in Wellington, and we're seeing all these new builds fail, which is just ludicrous. How can a new build fail? They haven't taken into account the correct R value on the building materials for heat pumps. So you try phoning up a landlord who's just bought a brand new house and saying, mate, your house hasn't passed the Healthy Homes. You can imagine the reaction you've got to get.
You were going to borrow one of those guns.
I think that's probably it, eh?